We have a question. So Camille, should we and Andre?
I just wanted just to say something that here I see that we are coming to some technical questions, which is interesting also. But I would say that most of our audience is also mainly from art school. So I would like to say that just that if you have any questions that which is not specifically related to controllers or don't hesitate to ask the question. So here we have someone. What makes a video game worthy of adding to MoMA's collection? I understand why. Do you see the question, Paul?
I do. So I can read it.
Yes.
So
Okay.
I understand why historically many games like Pac-Man and Space Invaders, etc., get in there, but I believe that selecting newer games, I'm guessing they meant newer games, can be challenging. It is very challenging, and that's why we haven't acquired a game in 4 years, because we've been deeply researching and meeting with designers and kind of really trying to focus on where video games have gone, because in the last 10 years, it's gotten incredible. There's so many more platforms, so many more independent game studios than there used to be. There are, because the barriers of entry are small. In the 1980s or 90s, you had to be a big company to make a video game, whereas now you can have a small team and put together some incredible stuff. So I've spent the last several years going to Gamescom, going to GDC in San Francisco, going to video game programs at colleges and meeting with independent designers. We've also been collaborating with other art museums. The Victoria and Albert Museum in London did an amazing exhibition on video games last year. So we go about the newer video games in the same way that we would go about acquiring any contemporary artwork. You meet with creators, you go to their studios, you talk to them, you talk to other colleagues in the museum, and you start to kind of refine where you want. So actually, the next round of acquisitions we'll be doing are all games from 2010 on. So we're really, because the first group we did sort of ended with Minecraft, right? And that's an old game at this point. So we really wanted to now focus on the present moment. So you'll see some that are very famous games, some that you've probably never heard of. But it is a challenge, and you have to, a game needs to both be aesthetically interesting, conceptually challenging, doing something unique, and it needs to feel when you play it like a masterpiece. And I think some of those ones I pointed out, like Monument Valley, I think is a masterpiece of a game. I think many of the, or Inside, Playdead's game Inside is, I think, a spectacularly moving and amazing game.
Yes, here, we are talking about, so there you have, you are collecting also so games which are produced by pretty famous brand, famous companies, but also like more independent games. I would almost would say like experimental games. Most of that games that you shown in the collection that you compared to some artworks from art history is I would say that what we could compare is mostly like the choice to show that games then also like what like how it's depicted from a games to like the relation with the how the subject is took from a painting, or but most of that artworks that are in the collection of the MoMA, I would say that most of them are not especially that's why it makes the difference also fine arts and design. Most of that games, they are, yes, product, like it's something which is planned, like it's part of a kind of economical process or economical protocol, and it has to solve also like some situation of a technical situation of space, like a memory, a technical also reason of the machine itself, like how to adapt the game to a specific controller, which is not exactly the same from a machine to another one, and so on and so on. What about like which is developed by an artist, that have no which is not a command, which is not a product, which is like an initiative by the artist itself, which I would say that it's from the very beginning, start from, it's an art initiative. So it's not a product, it's an experiment, an experience, interactive experience. Is that game, you have to be in charge to have a scientific approach to that game from the design interactive design department, or this has to come to some another, I don't know if it's the proper term, but another service of MoMA or another person, another specialist that have to consider that game or to this work of art?
I think well, these are good questions, and it's part of why when we've been going through this whole process, we've been in very close conversation with our colleagues in the film and cinema department, because I think if you think of the film industry and the video game industry as being kind of similar in their structure, right? They're collaborative enterprises that take a lot of voices. They're inherently commercial. They're not tied to the art world at all. They are really commercial enterprises that exist outside of the art world altogether. So we've always been in close conversation with the film department on these things. They've always been very interested in video games as well, as a lot of filmmakers are very interested in video games. So we are in constant conversation with, it's not just the design department. I think a key distinction I would say is that the design and architecture department took the lead on this, but it is an area that the entire museum is interested in. And we have conversations with paintings curators, film curators, performance art curators, and to really kind of broaden this. And then I see, I'm just gonna go, there's another great question that I'm going to read and then answer this one from Paul Harden.
Yes, Paul Harden question is very interesting too.
Yeah, well, this is a great question. To me, this is a small historical collection. How do you feel about the separation of these games from their original hardware and controllers, reducing their full artistic impact as experiences? With the challenge of selecting games, does MoMA have any ideas for curating larger experiences like RPGs? These older video games demonstrate art and hardware of a zeitgeist well, but how might a deeper experience and collection of feelings be captured and displayed in their same original value? Something is lost when you cannot be immersed over time. You're absolutely right. I always felt very uncomfortable with the fact that there's a lot of games we can't really make playable in the galleries. When we showed games like The Sims, or we had a massively multiplayer online game, EVE Online, you can't just sit down and play EVE for 5 minutes and get any kind of appreciation for that. You can with Tetris. You can play Tetris for 5 minutes and you've got it. You can play Pac-Man for 5 minutes and you've gotten it. But there's many, many games, some of the most fascinating ones, that a museum is really not well set up for that. And I think there is a lot of interest in presenting them in a different way. We did it one way for several years, but we are very much thinking of a way that more closely honors the experience of the game, because it is a time-based medium. In the same way that cinema is a time-based medium, you have to sit through the entire thing to really accurately get a grasp of that. And there are some films like Andy Warhol's Empire, which is 24 hours long. And we actually find ways at the museum to accommodate people doing that. There's another work by a contemporary artist named Christian Marclay called The Clock, which is another 24-hour piece. And we actually make the museum open for 24 hours whenever we show that piece. So I think, and there's other curators I've talked to at other institutions that really start thinking of video games as a performance, right? That they don't exist in a vacuum. They really are a social performance, and that we have to find some kind of way for a museum to honor that. Because if we don't, then we're going to be stuck with just showing Pac-Man and Tetris and games like that, when we really do want to try to honor some of these more complicated games. So it's something we're very much thinking about. As far as the hardware and the controllers experiences, I mean, that's another one that we have been struggling with. I want to emphasize that the way we showed it in 2013, 2014, 2015, was not the only way we're going to show it. We have a Pac-Man, we have cabinets, several cabinets, we have original hardware and controllers, but we always are struggling with balancing the desire to show them in their proper context, but also the realities of being a museum in Midtown Manhattan that gets 3 million people a year. And that if I put out my precious Magnavox Odyssey that Ralph Baer himself made for us 2 weeks before he died, that box will be destroyed in 10 minutes by our public. When we make furniture for the museum, when we select furniture, we often joke that it has to be prison grade. So it needs to be just as robust as if we were putting a chair in a prison, because the abuse that people put on these things is extremely limiting. So, hola, Paco. This is my cat Paco, who's come to join us, right? So I think there's a limitation to how a museum can do it, because let's be honest, a museum is not the proper place for a video game. A painting, the natural home for a painting, right? Its proper environment, like take a tiger and release it to its proper environment. The proper home for a painting is on a wall in a museum. The proper home for a video game is not in a museum. So our very standpoint is in a way kind of flawed. We're not the right place to show these things, but what we can do is bring a lot of attention to them and get people to start thinking about them. And hopefully they'll watch the demo that we made for EVE Online and be fascinated by it and then want to go home and play it. That's kind of the best we can do in a lot of these instances. It's maybe not possible to have a whole suite of couches and a bunch of consoles and people can come in and play EVE whenever they want to, or play The Sims, or play Civilization, or whatever they want to play in our museum. Maybe that's possible in certain limited circumstances, but there's going to be certain limitations to what we can achieve as a big, busy museum. So, Mikhail, let's see what you've got. So, seeing as games are an increasingly diverse medium existing across a variety of platforms, how do you feel about preserving and curating non-PC console games? I'm thinking of handheld games, smartphone games, programmable calculator games. You just dated yourself, Mikhail. Programmable calculator games, airplane seat screens, things like Simon, the memory game, Dance Dance Revolution. Actually, one of the games in our collection is Snake, which was developed for Nokia, for the Nokia cell phones in the 1990s. Mikhail sounds like he's old enough to remember those things. We actually acquired that from Nokia. They sourced a wonderful vintage Nokia cell phone from 1996. And it is my dream to have that cell phone on a wall and people can come up, and the screen on those things was this big, right? It was a tiny little screen. And I have dreams of a long line of people queuing to go play Snake on a Nokia cell phone. So we're certainly not limited to PC console games. And especially in the games that we're looking to acquire now, there's so many things that exist on, they're designed for tablets, they're designed for iOS or Android, or all kinds of platform, open source, the Flash games, the browser games. There is, you're right, we're so diffuse at this point in what kind of platforms games can exist on. So we're very much interested in that. Dance Dance Revolution would cause a riot at the Museum of Modern Art, so we're not going to do that one. That would be a bad idea. But Simon the video game, I mean, that's the memory game. Mikhail is taking me back to my childhood with all of these things. Calculator games, programmable calculator games. Oy. So I know I think you're
sorry. Like, it's interesting that Mikhail asked the questions and you mentioned Flash games. I don't know if I should talk about it, but like one of the side work of Mikhail is to archive Flash games. Like, he's currently researching on them. Maybe I'm wrong, but if he wants to maybe to intervene about that, Mikhail, about that, or maybe it's out of topic. I went maybe too far. I would not like.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. The thing is, I've not had the privilege of visiting MoMA, but I've been to several video game museums like dedicated dedicated game museums like the National Video Game Arcade in the UK, or the Nintendo-sponsored Ritsumeikan Archive in Kyoto, which is ironic. So in Kyoto, it's apparently fine to exhibit their game because that's where they are headquartered. But my concern has been with a lot of these museums and a lot of their collections, the selection process itself and the criteria that they're basing their selection on seems essentially to reinforce a certain bias as to what the classics are, right? So there's nobody questions at this point that we should preserve Pac-Man or we should preserve Space Invaders. These are the retro, the classics, the established things that everybody's nostalgic about. But that tends to overlook a lot of the lesser known stuff, and which doesn't have the same sort of visibility, doesn't have the same cultural clout, right? People don't really feel like it's such a terrible thing that, say, Flash is going away, right? The thousands and hundreds, you mentioned it yourself, like the entry barriers have been decreasing dramatically over the years. But a lot of these sort of lesser known titles are just, nobody really cares about them. And that's just a concern where that makes me wonder if people, that work in curation, that exhibit, that collect video games, have a sort of responsibility when it comes to shaping the collective memory of what games are and what they have been. And it's not much of a question, but I just wonder how you feel about this.
No, it's an excellent question, and it's one that we struggle with quite a lot because, on the one hand, we want to honor the entire story, and we have tried very hard to call out some independent voices. So Eric Chahi's Another World, which was an Amiga game, is not as well known. And that was one of the ones we acquired. Or Dwarf Fortress is another independently produced game. So there definitely are some that are not as well known. And I think the ones we're moving forward with to acquire are also a lot of very more independent games. I think, so we are reinforcing these kind of things. I mean, we're very nervous about creating a canon. Because that's not something we want to do. We want to say this is our perspective, and we invite other perspectives. But the important thing to remember is that we are not a history museum. We're not there are, like in the United States, we have the Smithsonian Institution. That is a history museum. Their job is to give the broad overview of an entire history. We don't have every Picasso painting. We have what we think of as the greatest Picasso paintings, but we don't think of ourselves as a museum of Picasso and that would represent his entire oeuvre. I think, and the same thing would hold true with video games. We can't have every single one. What we would want to do is instead, by pointing out what we feel are the great achievements in video games, to entice people to look at the richer history of this place and to think of, beyond just the console games. And the 1980s is not just about Atari. It's also about all the incredible stuff done on the Mac or on the Amiga or on the Commodore 64, or there's this whole rich range or of homebrew and shareware and this incredible kind of rich stuff. But our resources are limited. We don't have the kind of bandwidth or capacity to engage with these discussions. That being said, we have had many conversations. Oh, there's the ambulance. So now here come the riots. We have had many close conversations and collaborations with the Smithsonian here in the United States and the Library of Congress, which is another institution in the US that's looking into games preservation. The Library of Congress in particular was very actively getting into this field and actually starting to hire some people into documenting game history and looking into this. But that all stopped in the end of 2016 with a certain election. So that's no longer happening. And I think what I would want to see is more kind of collaboration between art museums that are much more limited in their scope, like MoMA, and historical institutions like the Smithsonian or institutions in the UK or France, or computer history museums, like in Berlin, the Computerspiele Museum, or the Computer History Museum out in California. And it's through conversations with institutions like what you guys are doing in Estonia. There's a similar institution in Oakland, California called the MADE Museum, a fantastic group of people out there. And I think I would love to see conversations between small video game nonprofits and collectives, big art museums like MoMA or the Victoria and Albert Museum, and also big history museums, because that's really, you need all of them. You need the ones that can handle the big scope of history. You need some that can do the kind of limited curation, and you need some of the small ones on the ground engaging with people and educating people about video game history. I think you need all parts.
Let's make it.
Yeah, let's do it. Okay.
Yeah, thanks so much. I have another one. As a side note, it was great to see that you have Dwarf Fortress, because that was not a game I would expect to see in a major museum. So that's quite different from what I've been seeing from the video game museums, except LVLup, which has been quite experimental and quite focused on the original and the pirated history, which has been overlooked. But you've been listing all these possibilities of you know, collaboration between different kinds of institutions, and that made me wonder, do you think there's room for collaboration between institutions and amateur preservationists? Right, there's a lot of communities online. Some of them have suffered because of Nintendo and the likes of them, but they've collected a lot of metadata. They've done a lot of sort of, grassroots level curation and stuff. So there's a lot of experience and knowledge there. And do you think there's any viability in working with these guys? Is that even feasible?
We have, on a very local level, with some of the New York community on that kind of level. So at the university here, NYU, the New York University, has a fantastic game center. And they also have a wonderful computer science department that we've engaged with on, and we actually got permission from Valve to take Portal as a case study, to actually go through the commented source code. So we have all of the commented programming source code for Portal, to go through it line by line and find, and kind of was put together. So we've done it, but it still has to be a kind of, because we had to make a lot of assurances to the intellectual, to a hacker collective, because then we'd be sued if what we're authorized of collaborate with these things. So I think we would want to. There's always going to be limitations, because a lot of these organizations you're talking about exist on kind of the boundaries of legal activity. And this, of course, varies on whether you're in the US or the EU or in Asian countries. So personally, I would love this to happen, but I can tell you lawyers at MoMA are very nervous about, because we are a big famous museum with a lot of money, and we're a favorite target of lawsuits, especially in the United States. People love to come to us to raid the money that we've got. So, but I think we are definitely looking into and doing some unofficial kind of collaborations. I can tell you that the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, we've done a lot of kind of cross-pollination and thinking with this, and the Cooper Hewitt Museum here in New York, and with NYU, and there's another one in a couple of other collectives here within New York. I think it will be a little harder to do internationally, just because of the legal. But good question.
If there is no more question, is it because people are shy, or please don't hesitate.
Very polite. Yeah, I think packaging, because we're interested in graphic design. We also, the same department as, we have posters and packaging, great design. We do have some of the packaging for some of these things. We've not shown them yet, but it kind of varies. So for certain works, we have a ton of packaging, but I also feel like if we were to do it, we'd want to show people stuff they're not familiar with. So I don't know what would be gained by showing the packaging for Pac-Man, or for the Atari console version of Pac-Man. But I would be very interested in showing something a little more rare, like Eric Chahi's packaging for the Amiga version of Another World. Could be quite interesting. We haven't done it yet.